What if I told you RFK Jr. just declared war on transgender care? 19 states immediately fought back. But here's what's really happening behind the scenes. This isn't just about medical policy, it's about a Kennedy using federal power to override doctors, states, and establish medical practice. And the way he did it reveals something disturbing about how this administration operates. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Today's story exposes the collision between ideology and medicine and shows exactly how constitutional boundaries crumble in real time. December 18th marked a turning point. RFK Jr., as Health and Human Services Secretary, issued what he called a declaration, not a regulation, not a rule, a declaration. That declaration labeled gender-affirming care for minors as unsafe and ineffective. But more importantly, it threatened to exclude doctors and hospitals from Medicare and Medicaid programs if they provided such care. Think about that for a moment. Kennedy essentially told medical professionals, abandon your patients or lose your federal funding. Choose your livelihood or your medical judgment. Within 6 days, 19 states sued. This wasn't slow bureaucratic response. This was panic-level legal mobilization. But here's where RFK Jr.'s strategy gets interesting. He bypassed every normal legal requirement for policy changes. Federal law mandates public notice and comment periods before substantive health policy changes. Kennedy ignored that entirely. He simply posted a document online and declared it policy. New York Attorney General Letitia James didn't mince words. Secretary Kennedy cannot unilaterally change medical standards by posting a document online. But that's exactly what he tried to do, and the legal implications are staggering. The Administrative Procedure Act exists specifically to prevent exactly this kind of executive overreach. Kennedy's declaration violates basic due process requirements that have governed federal agencies for decades. Let's examine what Kennedy actually said. He called gender-affirming procedures malpractice. His exact words, "This is not medicine, it is malpractice. Sex-rejecting procedures rob children of their futures. Those aren't medical assessments. They're ideological declarations disguised as policy." Major medical organizations, including the American Medical Association and American Academy of Pediatrics, consider gender-affirming care medically necessary and potentially life-saving for transgender youth. Kennedy positioned himself against the entire medical establishment. That's not policy disagreement, it's institutional warfare. But here's the truly revealing part. Kennedy based his declaration on an HHS report that urged greater reliance on behavioral therapy rather than broad gender-affirming care. That same report questioned established medical standards from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. So Kennedy commissioned a report that reached his predetermined conclusion, then used that report to justify overriding decades of medical consensus. This reveals Kennedy's real strategy: manufacture evidence to support ideological conclusions, then present those conclusions as scientific fact. It's the approach Kennedy used during his anti-vaccine advocacy. Find studies that support your position, ignore contradictory evidence, and present yourself as the lone voice of scientific truth. The difference now is that Kennedy has federal power to implement his conclusions. He's not just questioning medical consensus, he's using government authority to override it. When advocates become administrators, personal crusades become official policy. Kennedy's transformation from outside critic to inside enforcer shows how expertise can be weaponized for political ends. The mechanics of Kennedy's threat reveal the administration's real strategy. By threatening Medicare and Medicaid exclusion, Kennedy wasn't just making policy, he was creating financial hostages. Hospitals can't survive without federal healthcare funding. Kennedy knew this. His threat essentially said, comply with our ideology or face financial ruin. This isn't governance, it's extortion with a medical license. Consider the immediate impact. Even before the lawsuits were filed, major medical providers began limiting gender-affirming care. The threat alone achieved Kennedy's goal, even in states where such care is legal and protected. That's the genius of the strategy. You don't need to win in court if the threat itself accomplishes your objective. But Kennedy's declaration reveals something deeper about this administration's approach to institutional power. The 19-state lawsuit argues that Kennedy exceeded powers Congress granted to HHS. They're claiming he's essentially making law without legislative authority, and they're right. Kennedy's declaration attempts to define medical standards of care, something traditionally left to medical professionals and state authorities. This isn't just about transgender care. It's about whether federal agency heads can unilaterally redefine professional standards in any field. What happens when the Secretary of Education decides what constitutes good teaching? When the Secretary of Agriculture redefines safe farming practices? When any cabinet member simply declares their preferences to be federal policy? Kennedy's declaration isn't just bad health policy, it's a blueprint for administrative authoritarianism. The political calculations are equally revealing. Kennedy positioned his declaration as protecting children, but the state's lawsuit argues he's actually harming them. Massachusetts Attorney General Andrea Joy Campbell said the declaration threatens access to health care for millions who rely on Medicaid. Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield called Kennedy's claims false and warned about immediate, significant, and harmful impacts. These aren't partisan talking points. They're descriptions of real-world consequences. When you threaten to exclude hospitals from federal programs, you're not just affecting transgender care. You're threatening the entire healthcare infrastructure that serves vulnerable populations. Kennedy's ideological purity comes at the cost of systemic healthcare stability. Here's what makes this moment particularly dangerous. Kennedy isn't operating as a traditional health secretary. He's functioning as an ideological enforcer with medical credentials. Traditional health policy emerges from scientific consensus, peer review, and regulatory process. Kennedy's approach bypasses all of that in favor of executive declaration. The precedent this sets extends far beyond healthcare. If cabinet secretaries can simply declare their policy preferences and threaten financial consequences for non-compliance, what limits exist on executive power? We're witnessing the transformation of administrative agencies from regulatory bodies into ideological enforcement mechanisms. The legal challenges will likely succeed. Kennedy's procedural violations are too blatant to survive judicial review, but that may not matter. By the time courts intervene, healthcare systems will have already restructured around Kennedy's threats. Providers will have stopped offering care. Families will have lost access to treatment. The legal victory may come too late to undo the practical damage. This is a pattern we've seen repeatedly from this administration. Issue constitutionally dubious orders, achieve immediate policy goals, and let courts sort it out later. By the time judicial relief arrives, the status quo has already changed. The strategy is brilliantly cynical. Kennedy knows his declaration will be struck down, but he also knows that healthcare systems can't wait for court decisions. They must respond immediately to funding threats. So while lawyers argue procedural violations, hospitals implement Kennedy's preferences. The legal system becomes irrelevant because the practical system has already adapted. This creates a new form of executive power, governance by threat. You don't need legal authority if threats are credible enough to change behavior immediately. It's administrative coercion disguised as policy guidance. But there's a deeper question about Kennedy's role in all this. He campaigned as a health freedom advocate, someone who opposed government interference in medical decisions. Yet here he is, using federal power to override doctors, intimidate hospitals, and dictate medical practice. The contradiction isn't accidental. It reveals the essential hypocrisy of populist authoritarianism, claiming to oppose government power while systematically expanding it to serve ideological ends. Kennedy isn't reducing government interference in healthcare. He's weaponizing it against populations his administration opposes. Consider Kennedy's previous stances. He built his career opposing pharmaceutical companies and championing medical autonomy. He positioned himself as the defender of patient choice against corporate medicine. Now he's using federal authority to override medical judgment and eliminate patient choice. The only difference is the target. When Kennedy opposed COVID vaccine mandates, he called government medical interference tyrannical. When he opposes transgender care, he calls the same interference protective. The principle, government shouldn't dictate medical decisions, apparently applies only when Kennedy agrees with the medicine. The 19 states filing suit represent more than just legal resistance. They represent a fundamental disagreement about who gets to define medical standards in America. Should federal political appointees override medical professionals? Should ideological preferences trump scientific consensus? Should cabinet secretaries be able to threaten economic consequences for non-compliance with their personal beliefs? Kennedy's declaration answers yes to all those questions. The state lawsuits say no. This isn't just about transgender care. It's about whether expertise matters in policymaking, whether due process applies to federal agencies, and whether states retain any authority over medical practice within their borders. The coalition includes states like New York, California, and Illinois. Jurisdictions with significant healthcare infrastructure and legal resources. These aren't symbolic protests. They're serious constitutional challenges. But notice what's missing: any Republican-led states. This creates a dangerous precedent where constitutional principles become partisan positions. When procedural compliance becomes Democratic talking points rather than universal principles, the constitutional system itself becomes politicized. Kennedy is essentially betting that partisan support will insulate him from constitutional accountability. The lawsuit will test whether that bet pays off. The broader implications extend to every area of federal policy. If Kennedy can unilaterally redefine medical standards, what prevents other cabinet members from doing the same? We're potentially witnessing the normalization of administrative lawlessness. Cabinet secretaries who ignore procedural requirements, threaten economic consequences, and substitute ideological preferences for expertise. Constitutional government depends on institutional restraints and procedural requirements. Kennedy's declaration abandons both in favor of executive will. This is how democratic institutions erode, not through dramatic coups, but through the gradual abandonment of norms, procedures, and constitutional limits. The outcome of these lawsuits will determine more than transgender policy. They'll establish whether federal agencies must follow their own rules, whether professional expertise retains any role in policy making, and whether constitutional procedures still constrain executive action. Kennedy positioned himself as a medical freedom fighter. Instead, he's revealed himself as something much more dangerous, an ideological enforcer willing to use federal power to override medical judgment, due process, and constitutional limits. The 19 states suing him aren't just defending transgender care. They're defending the principle that expertise, process, and constitutional boundaries still matter in American governance. Whether they succeed will determine what kind of country we're becoming. What do you think? Is Kennedy protecting children from harmful procedures or using federal power to override medical expertise? Should cabinet secretaries be able to bypass normal procedures when they feel strongly about an issue? Drop your thoughts in the comments, but keep it substantive and respectful. If this analysis helped you understand what's really at stake, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that matter. Until next time, stay informed and stay vigilant.